All right. So mic check, 1 2 1 2. Give me one moment before I get with you. Let me see.
Mr. Kyle, I would never do that.
Give me a sec. Give me a sec. All right, all right. Testing, testing, 1 2. Testing, testing.
Give me a sec. Give me a sec.
All right. So here we go. I'm gonna just if you've been following this series, I recommend you watch it in order. Because I'm just gonna kind of jump into it from where I left off last time. And that's simply because I'm gonna keep it brief so it can be digestible. But I'm also just gonna talk. All right. I'm just gonna start basically where I left off last time and go from there, right? So last time we talked about the roots, how the roots of the situation is the issue. You understand how our worldview, how our framework, our spiritual identity was targeted, and the trunk. This is the image that we talked about last time. Moving on to the next slide, we're gonna get we're gonna directly talk about the colonial encounter, and I'm gonna talk both about European colonization of Africa and the enslavement of African people in, I should say, North America, because the Americas on in mass was very different. So what I'm saying was, and what we're going to see is that this is not simply a political event or an economic event, right? It did involve land, um, and it did involve the taking of people for labor, right? It was military violence and it was and it legally possessed people, right? All of that is real, all of that is documented. But in how Europe underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, what he said was what was taken was not just materials, but what was also taken was meaning, meaning and relationship with the universe. So if you look over here in the right column, colonialism specifically targeted certain things. It targeted our names, naming systems. The name is not just a label in African tradition. It's not just a unit, an identifying marker, right? When when you rename an enslaved person, right? When you rename an African person with a European name, right? That was that was the function of the destruction of identity, right? That was what it performed. Identity destruction, right? Who am I in relationship to my culture and to the world, right? It destroyed it interrupted, not destroyed, but it interrupted ancestral lineage connection, right? So if you cannot remember your ancestors, if you can't call on them by name, if you cannot maintain ritual practices that kept that relationship alive, then you lose your connection to the source of your identity, right? Also, right, when your language, when a people's language, the very words you speak is criminalized, when you can be beaten for speaking Yoruba, when you can be beaten for speaking Wolof, when you can be beaten for speaking Igbo, you lose your conceptual framework. You lose your worldview. African language in general, doesn't just use different words. It carries different understandings inside that word, right? It was a different a different philosophical category 100%, right? Now, the vocabulary of the sacred itself, right? When you replace a people's understanding of what is holy and what is profane or what is sinful, uh, when you replace their cosmology, their map of how the universe is organized, with one that places them on the bottom, the curse of Ham, black is sinful, black is bad, beware that black cat, so on and so forth. You remember that scene in Malcolm X. Um, this is something more damaging and devastating than physical violence, right? You have damaged their very conception of who they are and have taken away their will to resist and then even to imagine themselves as fully human with access to spiritual resources that sustained their ancestors for generations, right? Let's move on. Now, right, here we go. So you might ask yourself, right, why would the colonial powers bother with something as abstract as spiritual identity? They had guns, they had chains, right? So why did they need to attack the African worldview, right? So to answer that question, we have to look at this, right? Destroying physical resistance. Destroying physical resistance is much harder than preventing it from forming in the first place. One of the health maxims that they always say is prevention is better than cure. And in this context, they use that prevention is better than cure. It is easier and better to prevent resistance from forming than to try to suppress it, right? And the spirituality, their spirit, and a person's spiritual worldview is what forms the will to resist, right? So let's go through this slide, right? Labor control. If you can get an enslaved person, if you can get a person that is in bondage to believe that their suffering is divinely ordained, that God intended for them to be in this position, that patience and obedience in this life will be rewarded in the next, then you have done something that no amount of physical force could ever really do, right? You've turned a person into their own psychological jailer. In their own mind, they see this as they see this position in life as where they should be, right? They become their own jailer. They are the ones who keep themselves in prison. And what was that in the Matrix? The prison of your mind. This is what was preached from slaveholder pulpits across the American South. Servants, obey your masters. That right there, when they tell you to obey your master, that is not something that is neutral. That wasn't a neutral reading of scripture, right? That was a political program masked and disguised in religious clothing, right? And then land erasure, land theft, land legitimization, right? So the colonizer produced something called terra nullius, right? Empty land. And then so they're thinking, the idea is that the idea was that this land really had no real people on it. But how can land occupied by millions of people be empty? By what they ended up doing was redefining those people and redefining them as not being fully human because they weren't Christian. And then by defining these people as not fully human and and then that their spiritual relationship to the land as was not a real claim. When African people are redefined as pagans who worship demons rather than the true God, then their legal and spiritual claim to their ancestral land can be dismissed. That's what ended up happening. They dismissed their claim to their land as heathenism. And then the European Catholic Church provided that ideology that made the seizure of African land morally a moral obligation for European publics, right? It was a moral obligation to go in and free the savage, right? And then we're going to look at market creation, right? African economies were organized around the in general in the African epistemological framework. African economies were organized around communal land tenure. It was a gift economy, obligations, you know, people were obligated to redistribute um to redistribute the land, and it was rooted in their spiritual worldview. Now destroying that worldview, replacing the communal understanding with the individual, the relational with the transactional, created conditions for market penetration. You cannot sell individual property to people who don't believe in individual ownership. All right, let's move on. All right. Now, another key concept is identity formation, right? Identity formation in the diaspora. And then the word diaspora isn't really just a demographic term, right? It's a spiritual condition. To be in the diaspora is to live with a particular kind. To be in the African enslavement diaspora is to be with a particular question. And the question of who you are when the place that gave your people its name is no longer immediately accessible to you. Every person who has been forcefully removed from their homeland and their people, or every person who was born into a legacy of that removal, has to construct themselves again, has to reconstruct itself across a generational rupture. Right? You have taken their name, you have taken their land, you have taken their history, you have taken their identity from them, and thus they are lost in space and time, and then thus have to reform their identity. And this is why we have so many different political movements in the US, because this is the key problem that we have, right? We become Native Americans, we become Hebrew Israelites, we become Moors, we become everything but African because our African identity was stripped away from us. And so then we seek to fill in that gap with anything at the moment that would make sense. Any ideology and theology at the moment that comes around that helps fill in the gap and then make mental connections that make sense, right? So this construction of identity across ruptures isn't passive. African people didn't simply absorb whatever identity was imposed on them, right? So what we did was we negotiated, adapted, retained, innovated this identity and created new forms of identity that were genuinely African, even when they didn't look like anything that existed on the continent. So there are three forces: is memory. That was what was carried across the rupture in body and song, in story and practice. But the thing about memory is it's partial. It's never like complete. You only remember parts of things. So, but they're substantial as well, you know. And then African people carry more than what their captors intended, right? Syncretism, adaptation, what was created in a new context, voodoo, candomblé, the conjure tradition, the ring shout. These are not diluted African traditions. They are African traditions in the diaspora, transformed by new conditions while retaining their deep logic and their worldview structure and the future identity of being imagined right? What does a liberated African person look like? What does a liberated African community look like, right? This is this is what was the unintended consequence. All right. So what actually happened to African spiritual identity in the process of enslavement, right? Because I find that people often know the history intellectually, but haven't fully felt the weight of it, right? Stage one was capture, right? Stage one is the capture. The initial separation from the land, right? And in virtually every African spiritual tradition, the land is sacred. Specific mountains, rivers, forests, groves, these are not just location, right? They are presences where you can have divine and ancestral encounters. And then to be forcefully removed from that land is to be separated from your cosmological infrastructure, right? You cannot maintain the rituals that depend on physical presence and geography. So separation of spiritual identity. That's what the capture did. Now the middle passage, right? Is we they say anywhere between 12 to 16 million people were transported between 1500 and 1900, and a third of them died. But think about what the survivors faced. You arrive in a world with no cosmological map, no way to really ground yourself or root yourself in that reality, right? The stars are different, the planets are different, the ancestors were on the other side of the ocean. Your ritual space was on the other side of the ocean. Every ritual, every practice, every spiritual technology you possessed that tied you to the world was no longer existing for you. You were taken completely out of your spiritual context. Then the renaming of you, right? In the African worldview, the name is not just a label, but a spiritual identity. It identifies your destiny, right? The Kemetic tradition identifies the Ren, right? And that's one of the five aspects of their soul. Your name is an aspect of your soul. And it's not chosen arbitrarily. It's done through destiny, right? What in the ancestral realm, you made agreements to come to Earth to do something very specific, and the name reflects that. The name reflects that. All right. Online, I am Cosmic Sankofa, right? My spiritual name is Himnetra. Now, when that was chosen, that was given to me at the time, I know it is a title of priest, and it's a title of high priest. Um, but that helps define who I am, him, also Benu Heru Mentu Hotep Shep Songkamen. Like these are specific titles that tie me to destiny, to a destiny that was in that we'll get into that later, right? But whenever in the in the diasporic context, when you destroy the name, you damage the soul. When enslaved Africans were given European names, when you became John, Mary, Caesar, so on and so forth, these were names chosen specifically to humiliate you, right? It changed your identity. And then religious conversion, right? African spiritual practice was criminalized. The drum was banned, gathering was restricted. Yet, even here, African people found ways to maintain the interior of their tradition, which brings us to stage five, the children born into this rupture, right? With no living memory of Africa, they were the first fully diaspora generation, right? But we can still see African sensibility, African relational, African ethics, African beauty, African spiritual orientation still persist, right? And that was the miracle. So I'll go through a few more and then I'll stop again, right? So we're going to talk about cultural continuity. Um, the most important thing I can say, I guess, about this concept is continuity does not require stasis, right? It doesn't require for things not to be moving, right? Now I've met people who dismiss African American cultural traditions because they don't look exactly like what they know about West African culture. That's not African, right? It's been contaminated by Christianity. That's a syncretism. It's mixed up. As if, and people think that mixing is bad, as if though there's anything on this planet that is pure, right? Everything is a mixture. Even in the African context, it moves and lives and breathes and mixes, right? Right. But mixing, when you mix the traditions, that didn't automatically means loss. It was adaptation. An adaptation for African people that was under impossible conditions, right? And so that's not a failure. That was a brilliance of survival. So here are some examples of how the African worldview survived in the diaspora, right? That informs that were African in origins, even though they look different on the surface, right? Voodoo, right? In Haiti, enslaved Africans, primarily from Dahomey, Benin, right? They reimagined the Ewe Fawn spiritual tradition underneath a Catholic surface, right? The Lua, the divine forces of voodoo, are recognizable as transformed versions of Dahomey spirits, right? The rituals, this cosmological structure, the framework, all of it was African, wearing Catholic saints' names, right? And that was a camouflage. Conjure and hoodoo. These are African Americans' traditions of root work and conjure that preserves the West African and Central African herbalism, spirit communication, and protective rituals, right? But this practice is driven underground, stripped of its ceremonial context, fragmented, but it persisted in families and communities across the South, right? Conjuring and hoodoo. Then we have the ring shout, right? A ritual movement that that appeared in African communities, in African religious gatherings, right? And then it's recognized, it has having connection to African sacred dance traditions, right? And then, but the slaveholders, they thought it was Christian worship. Then we have the oral narrative and trickster traditions, right? Anansi in West Africa, Briar Rabbit in the American South, surviving the crossing, adapting form, but containing the worldview. This is what African people did. They held on, and what they held on to matters enormously for who we are. Let me see something. Hold on. I want to make sure that I can share my sound with this next one.
Worldview lives beneath the surface, shaping culture, guiding action, and sustaining identity through time.
Cultural continuity describes how knowledge, values, and practices endure across disruption and upheaval. Continuity moves through adaptation, through memory, and through transformation beneath visible systems. Spiritual systems carried rhythm, structure, and ancestral connection across generations and environments. In new lands, those systems re-emerged, reshaped by pressure while maintaining internal continuity. Knowledge of plants, spirit, and healing remained encoded within systems of lived and practical wisdom. That knowledge continued quietly, preserved through repetition, practice, and everyday lived experience. Circular movement expressed unity, rhythm, and alignment within African communal spiritual life. That same motion continued, carrying encoded meaning through movement, sound, and collective memory. Stories transmitted knowledge, values, and strategy through symbol, humor, and layered meaning. Those narratives adapted across language, maintaining structure while shifting form to meet new realities. Across time and space, systems changed shape while preserving function, memory, and direction. Continuity remains wherever knowledge is remembered, practiced, and passed forward with intention. Nothing vanished. It moved, adapted, and continued beneath the surface of history.
All right. So I'm going to end this right here because I wanted to keep these brief and then pick it up again tomorrow and so on and so forth. I'm going to keep coming with some more information and just continuing having these conversations when I can. Light and love, peace and blessings. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Hit that share